Okay, hi guys. I hope you can hear me. We've got nine people here watching, so welcome. I hope you guys are having a nice afternoon, weekend, and finding time to study as well. So we had this is the third lecture in our series. We had a lecture on in the week on the visual system and some of the cranial nerves. So hopefully you've had a chance to review some of that stuff before we jump into this system, because this one is quite a tricky one for a lot of students, myself included. I found it quite tricky when I was learning the auditory system, partly because the book. So that's this part one book I have here. Is quite difficult to study the system from that book. So you have to use some other sources sometimes to help supplement the learning, a lot of pictures, etc. So I'm just going to dive in. If you have any questions at any time in the PowerPoint, just feel free to type in the chat. I can see it in front of me, so I'll try and answer it as fast as I can. I'm just going to move my icon. Okay, so just to run through the format of the lecture, we're going to discuss the three parts of the ear, the three divisions of the ear. So you can see it's external ear, middle ear, and the internal ear. So I've divided up the three parts as the textbook does. I've got there's a lot of detail regarding the middle ear, and then again regarding the internal ear. So we'll talk about that in the detail as I've explained here. And then I want to spend a bit of time talking about the nerve. My PowerPoint presentation has details as more information for the vestibular cochlear nerve than is in the actual textbook. But hopefully you can use my lecture slides to study the nerve as well in more detail, since you'll need to know the nerve almost perfectly for when you study the cranial nerves. So cranial nerve lecture is coming up soon. So this should be a nice overview for that. And then I've got a few test questions. So these are mock robot questions I've made myself based on the ones you'll receive this summer in your exam. And yeah, so let's dive into that. So this is just a nice overview scheme of everything we're going to be talking about today. So the colors show you quite nicely the different parts of the external ear. So the outer ear in this orange color, this section is the auricle, so cartilaginous section covered in skin. We have the external acoustic meatus, which has two parts. This purple pink cavity is the middle ear, which I'm gonna model as a cube. We need to talk about the borders, we need to talk about the contents, and then I'm going to talk about the internal ear. So internal ear is, I think, most problematic for students. We'll spend a lot of time talking about the different parts of the internal ear. This is the same image in Nettas. So if you're studying from Nettas, I always recommend Nettas or Sabota to study alongside. You'll find this scheme in there. So external ear. In terms of the auricle, which is auricle or pinna, which is the outer ear, all you really need to say, there's not much information here. The main things you need to explain are the ridges and the folds and recesses you find. So simple scheme like this, and you can see all of these ridges. So outermost rim here is called the helix. Antihelix is the next parallel sort of cartilaginous ring. You can see there are two crura. Between the crura, you can see this area. This is called the triangular fossa. We can see the area between the helix and the antihelix is called the scapha or the scaphoid fossa. This is the tragus. Here we have the intertragic notch and the lobule. So tragus, antitragus, intertragic notch, and lobule. So just important to know that this is a structure made of cartilage, with the exception of the lobule. The lobule is skin and fat and some small vessels, capillaries, and it's anchored to the temporal bone, fixed to the temporal bone by ligaments and muscles. So now jumping into a bit more detail. So external acoustic meatus. So this scheme here just for your own orientation, is showing the external acoustic meatus here. So it's showing, if I just go back a few slides, it's cutting off somewhere here. So you can see this medial part of the meatus, and then you can see the middle ear. So this is the medial part of the external acoustic meatus. This would be the tympanic membrane, and this is the tympanic cavity, also known as the middle ear. What are the two parts? So the two parts, we have the initial portion, the outermost or lateral part is the cartilaginous part, around 8 millimeters in length, and I've just included some of the important talking points. So the superior and the posterior walls covered by a very thin fibrous membrane, and this is different. This is where the cartilaginous portion differs to the osseous part. Again, if I just recap, if I just go rewind a couple of slides, you can see very clearly that this section here is the cartilaginous part, and this section here is the osseous part. So you can see the borders, the temporal bone here, forming the boundaries or the borders of the canal, meaning that this is why it's the osseous part. The osseous portion is significantly longer, and you can see here, this is what I've mentioned. So the part of the temporal bone is the tympanic part. So hopefully you should try and you should remember the different parts of the temporal bone: squamous, tympanic, petrous, etc. So if you need to recap, go and recap the temporal bone, because it's very, very important to know for this system. In terms of functions, so Oracle, I think your functions are quite obvious: sound transduction, whereas the external acoustic meatus, again, sound transduction, also contains ceruminous glands which produce the cerumen, and tragi, which are these hair-like projections, sort of serving as a protective function as well. There's not really much to say, as you've seen in the slides. There's not really too much to explain when it comes to the external ear, but when we talk about the middle ear, there's a lot more to discuss. So I want to just start by, I've got two slides on the tympanic cavity. So just for your reference, middle ear, also known as the tympanic cavity. It can be modeled like this scheme I've got on the right hand side. So this is like it's a very simple cube. In reality, it's not a cube. It's a convex cuboid structure. This space here is the tympanic cavity. It's a very detailed diagram. It's showing you all the vessels and structures surrounding the cavity itself. This slide is included just to show you, just to illustrate the walls. Okay, so I mentioned it's a six-sided shape, so model it like a cube. So we have 6 walls. So the lateral wall in this scheme has been removed. So this is the angle we're looking at. We're looking at from the lateral side, and that is the tympanic membrane. So very important to remember that the lateral wall is the tympanic membrane. And therefore it's called the membranous wall. Okay, so you can see here that these walls, denoted by the anatomical directions, also have other names, and the other names are logical when you think about what structures are there adjacent to, or which structures they have inside them or running through them. So medial wall is the one we're looking at directly here, which is this pinkish purple color. That's called the labyrinthine wall. It's called the labyrinthine wall for a couple of reasons. We'll talk about what's on the other side of that wall later. It's the inner ear, so there's a few parts which we'll talk about later. So hopefully the terms will start to make sense as you study this topic. Superior wall, or the roof, is called the tegmental wall. The reason it's called the tegmental wall is because the roof is formed by what's called the tegmen tympani, which is again tympanic portion or a specific structure of the tympanic part of the tympanic bone, which is called the tegmentum. Inferior wall or caudal wall, so this blue color, this is the jugular wall, and you can see in this image this blue structure. This is the internal jugular vein, so it's been labeled here. So that's why we have the internal jugular vein running beneath the tympanic cavity. So the inferior wall is called the jugular wall. Posterior wall is this green structure. So this wall here, this is called the mastoid wall because the mastoid process is over here. We have all these big aerated mastoid air cells. So name becomes logical. And anterior wall is the carotid wall. So nicely in red here, because you can see we have the external carotid artery here. Internal carotid artery running in front of the anterior wall. Okay, so that's the first thing, just to get your head around and orientate yourself around the walls. So the next thing to talk about is the contents itself. So I mentioned, I just want to recap, this space is a very narrow space. We model it like a cube, but it's actually a biconcave lens structure. And I'm going to just talk about the structures we find on each of the walls. So you can treat this tympanic cavity as a anatomical space. Just to answer the question, what's the significance of the mastoid cells? So mastoid cells, there's a lot of spaces in the skull filled with air, so they provide like buoyancy. They have functions in producing nitric oxide. They have functions in sound resonance. So it's just to create the lightweight effect of the skull. And the tympanic air cells are covered in mucosa as well, so they produce a lot of this gas and other substances. So back to the middle ear cavity. Yeah, sorry, my mistake. It's a biconcave. So it's basically, if I just show you, I made a mistake in what I was explaining. So maybe, yeah. So you can see from this scheme, we have, if we're looking at the actual the middle ear, like concavity is like, I guess, if you're looking from the outside, is the inward positioning of the membrane, and then the vestibular membrane here on the other side. So yeah, correct, concave. So back to this structure. If we look at the lateral wall first, again, removed. Only thing you need to say, it's the tympanic membrane. The next slide is focused on the tympanic membrane, so we'll talk about that in a bit more detail. Medial wall, the labyrinthine wall. The first thing we see is the promontory. So the blue structure in the middle is the promontory, and the medial wall is, first of all, is the wall or the boundary, anatomical boundary between the tympanic cavity and the inner ear. So the promontory is you just imagine it as like a protuberance. So the protuberance from the other side. So something is kind of pushing into the middle ear cavity, and that something is the cochlea. So we'll talk about the cochlea in a second. So to be more specific, it's the first turn or the first basal convolution of the cochlea. We'll learn it's like a spiral-shaped structure. So the first turn imprints or has an impression on the other side to form this promontory. From the middle ear itself, on the promontory, we have grooves running in the midline. So these are this is just like a sulcus or a groove you'll see in the book. It's sulcus promontory, and this is for the tympanic plexus. So this network here is very simplistically drawn, but it's representing the tympanic plexus. These yellow structures are nerve fibers. So tympanic plexus we'll talk about in a bit more detail in a second. Actually, yeah, in terms of the detail for now, all you need to know is that the tympanic plexus, a plexus, first of all, is a bundle of nerves which contains fibers from more than one origin. So multiple nerves can form a plexus. So for this plexus, we have the tympanic nerve. Tympanic nerve is a branch of the glossopharyngeal nerve, and we have sympathetic nerve fibers which are coming from the internal carotid artery. Okay, so tympanic nerve is over here, and these sympathetic nerves coming from the internal carotid artery are over here, and that's what forms the tympanic plexus. Other structures we can see this green structure here. Just in case it wasn't clear already, this wall is the anterior wall. This is the posterior wall. So you can see here posteriorly and superiorly we have the oval window. Oval window is also known as the fenestra vestibuli. I don't always advocate studying Latin and English. I usually say pick one. But in some cases like this one, it can be useful to learn the Latin because we have the oval window, as also known as the fenestra vestibuli, and the fenestra cochlea is over here. So sometimes learning the Latin, if you pay attention to the Latin, it might help you with the functions. So oval window, what's the oval window significance? The oval window is covered by the footplate of the stapes, which is one of the small bones which we find in the middle ear. And again, that's communication to the inner ear, so through the oval window. And the round window is covered, so the round window is seen over here. Round window is covered by what's called the secondary tympanic membrane. And in terms of structures on the medial wall, that's all you need to mention. Okay. I just want to jump to the roof, so the superior wall or the roof. So the roof is, as I mentioned before, is also known as the tegmental wall. Which because it is the anterior surface of the petrous part of the temporal bone, separates the tympanic cavity. So this wall separates the tympanic cavity from the cranial cavity. So the structures we find on it are very simply just this one foramen here. So this is a canal for the lesser petrosal nerve. So this is something which will come up again and again when you study this section. But just to reiterate, we have a branch coming from cranial nerve number 9. Cranial nerve number 9 is the glossopharyngeal nerve, and this branch it gives off is this branch here. So this is the tympanic nerve. The tympanic nerve enters into the tympanic cavity, contributes to this plexus, and the nerve which exits the plexus is called the lesser petrosal nerve. Just a detail I wanted to just mention. The floor, so the jugular wall, the floor separates the tympanic cavity from the jugular fossa, and the structures you can see here, we can see obviously the tympanic canaliculus or the tympanic canal, which is for the tympanic nerve, and also some vessels, so anterior tympanic vessels. Also important to remember those, yeah, because they haven't been illustrated in this diagram. So tympanic nerve and anterior tympanic vessels. Posterior wall and then anterior wall. So posterior wall, we can see this large irregular aperture here. This is an opening, a point of communication between the middle ear, the tympanic cavity, and the structures behind. So these mastoid air cells behind, and this is therefore called the adductus, or opening to the mastoid antrum. And then we have a series of prominences. So these are structures which are located on the other side of the wall, which are pushing into the pushing the wall and forming this impression or protuberance. So the first one we see is so just to answer the question before we move on. Facial nerve, no, facial nerve doesn't contribute to the tympanic plexus. It's the glossopharyngeal nerve and the sympathetic nerves. Sympathetic nerves coming from the internal carotid artery. So back to the posterior wall. So we have so I mentioned the adductus. We have impression. So we have an impression over here. This is the lateral semicircular canal. So just remember that for now. We'll talk about what this is in more detail in a second. But the lateral semicircular canal causes the impression, or creates this impression here. And then we have another impression which is caused by this structure, this yellow structure. This is the facial nerve. So the facial nerve, you can see it coming here, and it has this very characteristic or typical 90-degree turn called the geniculate area. So this is impressioning as well. Then we have this muscle. So this is the stapedius muscle, and the stapedius muscle lies inside a structure which is called the pyramidal eminence. So this is a pyramidal eminence which contains the stapedius muscle. And finally, we have this canaliculus, or opening, or for the canal of the chordae tympani. So chordae tympani is a branch of the facial nerve, but it passes completely through the middle ear cavity, and it has no contribution to the tympanic plexus. Okay. And finally, anterior wall. So the anterior or the carotid wall. So structures we can find here. First of all, I'm going to just start from down here. So these are the carotico-tympanic nerves. So just for a bit of context, sympathetic nerves generally form plexuses, as you can see, around arteries and veins. So this particular artery is the internal carotid artery. So the plexus around it is just literally just called the sympathetic plexus around the internal carotid artery. And these nerves, which originate from the plexus, pierce and penetrate through the anterior wall to enter into the tympanic plexus, are called carotico-tympanic nerves. So therefore the openings would be called canals or canaliculi, multiple. Okay, the next thing we find, so this image, which has been taken from Masaryk, doesn't illustrate this that clearly, but it shows us two structures essentially. This green structure, and it shows us this muscle-like structure. So in actual theory, there is one big structure, one big opening, which contains both of these structures. The opening is called the musculotubal canal. And inside the musculotubal canal, we find the two structures. So if you look at the name, we can divide it up. So musculo, so muscle. The superior part of the tube contains a muscle. That is the tensor tympani muscle. And the inferior part of the tube contains, inferior part of the structure contains the tube. So tubal referring to the auditory tube. Auditory tube, also known as the pharyngotympanic tube or the Eustachian tube. So all these names mean the same thing. And we're going to talk about these in a bit more detail later on. So musculotubal canal, and then finally we talked about this structure, which was the chorda tympani. So chorda tympani from the facial nerve, and you can see here there is also an opening here. So this opening is a special name, the petrotympanic fissure. Hopefully you remember this name from studying the bones of the skull. If you need to go back and study it, go through the temporal bone, specifically the tympanic portion, and you'll remember. It'll come back to you. Hopefully, this petrotympanic fissure. There are a few structures which go through the petrotympanic fissure. The one that we can see is the facial nerve. Not the facial nerve, the chorda tympani, which is from the facial nerve. We also have anterior mallear ligaments and anterior tympanic vessels. Okay. So we've just been through the walls of the tympanic cavity, and we've been through the structures we find on the walls and the structures, anatomical structures, which we find inside. I'm going to talk about the lateral wall, the tympanic membrane, and then I'm going to discuss a bit more detail about the structures we've mentioned and also the things which are actually missing from this diagram. So hopefully you understand where this is found in the ear, and you can understand that there are certain structures missing. So the things that are missing, namely the ossicles. So these are the three small bones we have inside the middle ear. So let's talk about the tympanic membrane before we talk about the ossicles. So so middle ear tympanic membrane. This is a very thin membrane. It's opaque, so semi-transparent or translucent membrane, which is the I guess the anatomical end of the medial-most part of the external acoustic meatus. On the other side of this membrane, so we are looking laterally. If you didn't know, this is ventral, anterior, dorsal, posterior, and we're looking at this from a lateral perspective. So as the description says, otoscopic view, this is the device used to observe the tympanic membrane. So two parts of the membrane. Externally, so from this lateral side, is covered in very, very thin skin. On the internal side, so the internal structure is coated by the mucosa, which is common for the middle ear cavity, the tympanic cavity, and that is a very thin mucous membrane. This circle forms the annulus. This is a ring, cartilaginous ring, called the annulus. And you can see there are several structures which we need to be able to describe. And it wouldn't hurt to be able to draw this scheme, so know how to draw a very simplistic scheme for the tympanic membrane, looking at this view here. So there is a series of impressions which are caused by the ossicles, so the malleus, namely because the malleus is what communicates with the tympanic membrane. So the handle of the malleus is seen here, okay, in the middle. This is the central structure. The handle of the malleus is behind here, and we can see these mallear folds. Malleolar or mallear folds, both mean the same thing. So we can see a posterior fold here and an anterior fold. Between them, we can see this lateral process of the malleus. So don't worry, we'll talk about the different parts of the ossicles in the next slide. So just for now, just remember we have a posterior and an anterior fold. Between them is the lateral process, and the prominence as well. Lateral process of this is the malleolar prominence, which has been labeled here as the lateral process of the malleus. Now the division of the membrane, which we do need to discuss just a bit briefly in anatomy, is the two parts of the membrane itself. So we have two parts. So we can see there's a section here which is the pars flaccida. This is a red and relatively loose area, and the remainder is the pars tensa, so tense part over here. Okay. Okay. Talking about the ossicles, so I've got a couple of slides here talking about the bone structures themselves, and then the ligaments ligaments and articulations in a bit more detail. So three bones: malleus, incus, and stapes. They are oriented in that way. So the tympanic membrane you can see here in this scheme, with direct communication with the malleus. The malleus articulates with the incus, incus articulates with the stapes, and the stapes articulates with the medial wall of the middle ear, so the tympanic membrane. Tympanic middle border of the tympanic cavity. So the malleus has three, a head, a neck, and three processes. So I'm going to just take you to the next slide briefly. So this is the malleus here. We have a head with this articular surface, a neck, and we have three processes. So we have an anterior process, which is not seen in this because we're looking at the malleus from the posterior aspect. We have a lateral process, which can be seen here, and we have this manubrium, the long process here. So this is what we saw a couple of slides ago. So I'm going to just show you this image, and then go back 2 slides. So this was the handle of the malleus, or the manubrium of the malleus. We've already mentioned the head articulates with the body of the incus. So this is the head articulating with the body of the incus, and we talked about the processes. In terms of the incus, incus can be seen as like, something that looks similar to a molar or a premolar tooth, except that we have these two roots which come off at right angles, and one is clearly shorter, one is clearly longer, one is clearly shorter. So we have a body, and we have these two crura, so crus longum and crus breve, so the long one and the short limb. There is a process here, the lenticular process, which actually articulates with the head of the stapes. So coming off the end of the long limb, we have the lenticular process, which is found here. So just to show you again on here, we have the body, the short crus, long crus, and then the lenticular or lentiform process. Okay. And the stapes is the last bone in the chain, and again we have head, which is the initial portion, the neck, we have the base, which is here, the base or the foot plate, and we have these two crura, anterior and posterior crus, and like I mentioned, the base occupies the oval window. So base, also known as the foot plate, occupies the oval window. So hopefully you remember, oval window is a structure which we find on the medial wall of the tympanic cavity. Okay, so now we've talked about the external ear, external acoustic meatus, and the tympanic cavity. So hopefully you should start to understand how the sound transmission takes place. This is all just for sound transmission. It's nothing to do with balance. Okay, we'll talk about balance from another angle in a second. So a bit more detail about the ossicles. So now we know how the bones are oriented in the middle ear. We need to know the joints. So the joints between them. The tympanic membrane, between the tympanic membrane and the malleus, there is no joint per se. It's just anchored to the membrane itself. The first joint is between the head of the malleus and the incus, the body of the head of the incus, and that's the inculomalleolar joint. The next joint is located between the incus and the stapes. This is called, again, logically, the incudostapedial joint. And a couple of things I want to just mention as well before we go on to the other joints. The incudo-malleolar joint, it's the first joint we see here. This is a diarthrosis. So if you need to, it's a saddle-shaped joint, exactly. It's a diarthrosis. For those of you who need to go and recap, go and revise joints, general arthrology. Make sure you're comfortable with the general topic, so the classifications of all the joints. So then hopefully this will make more sense to you. But just to give you a very, very brief revision sessions, like we have two types of joints. We have synarthrosis and we have diarthrosis. So diarthrosis are the common when you think of a typical synovial joint capsule with accessory ligaments and membranes and articulatory surfaces. This is a diarthrosis. So what I want to highlight is that the incudo-malleolar joint and the incudostapedial joint are both diarthrosis, whereas the stapedo-vestibular joint is not a diarthrosis. So incudo-malleolar joint is a saddle or sellar joint. That's the classification. And the incudostapedial joint, so the second joint over here, this is modeled as an enarthrosis. Okay, so a ball and socket joint, enarthrosis. And the last joint I mentioned, which is not a diarthrosis, it's the different texts refer to it as different types of joints, but it can be modeled as a syndesmosis or an amphiarthrosis. It's a restricted type of joint. So that's between the stapes, the footplate of the stapes, and the vestibule. So the vestibule is on the other side, which is part of the inner ear, which we'll talk about in a moment. This is a restricted type of joint. There are obviously accessory ligaments around all of these joints, so superior, anterior, lateral, and posterior ligaments, all of the malleus, and an annular ligament of the stapes. So this is the annular ligament of the stapes. So off the top of my head, I can't think of all the lists. I can't list all the examples of sellar joints, but I've got a document which I used for special arthrology, where I classified all the different types of joints. So definitely check out the document I've posted on the MIMSA Hub. For like, if you want to just study one type of joint, look at first of all the general arthrology section in the textbook. That will give you some examples. And then just look at the document I've posted on the MIMSA Hub. It's titled just joints, and I've classified every single joint, so hopefully that should help. Okay, so we discussed the structures inside the cavity. We talked about the ossicles, the ligaments, and now the only other two structures to mention, which we briefly touched on, were the muscles and the auditory tube. So from the scheme of the middle ear, we saw that there were two muscles. So the two muscles we have are the tensor tympani muscle and the stapedius muscle. Okay, and I've just listed here very simply the origin, insertion, function, and innervation. So these are the four things you need to know for every muscle. So you need to know them for these two muscles as well. Just to go back slightly, posterior wall, we have the pyramidal eminence, which contains the stapedius muscle. Anterior wall contains the musculotubal canal, with the superior portion being occupied by the tensor tympani muscle. Okay. Now, the function closely relates to the name. Okay, so the tensor tympani muscle, you can see its origin. It's on actually part of the auditory tube, so the Eustachian tube we talked about, and the insertion, which is this is the part I want to draw your attention to. It's the handle of the malleus. So hopefully you remember, and you can see the muscle here inserting onto the handle of the malleus. Hopefully you remember that the handle of the malleus is in direct communication with the tympanic membrane. So the origin insertion should help you, and the name should all help you with the function. Okay, so it's tensing the tympanic membrane. So you can see what it does specifically when it pulls the handle inwards, and it reduces the oscillation amplitude. Okay. The second thing I want to draw your attention to is the innervation. So you'll study the muscles. You'll study when you study the innervations, you'll study the muscles. You'll study the innervations of each muscle. That's one way of studying innervations. The other way is to study the nerves. So you'll study, for example, fourth cranial nerve and learn all the muscles it innervates. Fifth cranial nerve and all the muscles that innervates. So there's, you're gonna recap what I'm about to tell you a few times over from different angles. So what I want to mention is that the tensor tympani muscle is innervated by the trigeminal nerve. So cranial nerve V3 we talk about, V3 being V denoting the Roman numeral number 5, so that means the fifth cranial nerve. The fifth cranial nerve is the trigeminal nerve, and when we write V3 we mean the third branch of the trigeminal nerve, which is called the mandibular nerve. So the mandibular nerve gives off a nerve to tensor tympani. Okay, so tensor tympani, just please memorize this. Tensor tympani is innervated by the trigeminal nerve. In contrast, the stapedial muscle, or stapedius muscle, I'm going to just jump to the innervation, is innervated by the facial nerve. So this is the seventh cranial nerve. So very important to remember the difference. Stapedius muscle, we've talked about its origin inside this pyramidal eminence, and the insertion is the posterior surface of this neck of the stapes. So we can see the muscle here, very small muscle, is innervated by the facial nerve and inserts onto the neck of the stapedius, of the stapes. Sorry. What is it doing? It's reducing oscillatory range. Okay, by contracting, we're moving the footplate away from the oval window, so that we won't have as many vibrations being transduced into the cochlea, just very simply, into the inner ear. So hopefully the muscles make sense. This is a nice scheme I've pulled from Gray's Anatomy. And now let's talk about, these two images are relating to the auditory tube. So there are three names. You may have heard of it through any of these three names. And a very brief introduction here. So so what does it do? It connects the tympanic cavity to the nasopharyngeal cavity. Okay, so again, this is a nice little recap to the respiratory system. You should remember that we have the nasopharynx, we have the oropharynx, and we have the laryngopharynx. The three parts of the pharynx, so the initial portion of the respiratory system. When you study the nasopharynx, you'll be familiar with this scheme in this area. We have the torus tubarius. We have a number of muscles. So there's an opening here. The opening is for the eustachian tube. So now we're looking at the other end of the tube. Okay, so this is the tube again in blue, originating from the middle ear and extending all the way and opening into the nasopharynx. It's around 35 millimeters and it's got two parts. Very simply, the first portion, originating from the bony structure of the temporal bone, is the osseous part, and the second part is the fibrocartilaginous portion. So after leaving the skull, it's just fibrocartilaginous. And I've just denoted here the start and the start point and the termination point of each part. What is the function? The function is air pressure equalization. So when you think about swallowing, when you're climbing to high altitudes, or if you're in a plane, you might feel like a sharp sensation, painful sensation in your ear, and then you swallow, and this pain is mitigated. This is because you're equalizing the pressure, the atmospheric pressure, with the pressure in your tympanic cavity. Okay. Right. So I want to spend a bit of time now on the internal ear. I've just got this scheme here on the right hand side, just a bit of recap. We've talked about the external ear, talked about the middle ear, and now we're going to talk about all this stuff going on here. Okay, so this scheme shows the bony labyrinth. This is both of these show the bony labyrinth, and this shows the membranous labyrinth. This is in here just to show you the orientation. So this is the internal ear. So this whole structure is internal ear, and you can see how it looks when it's fit inside the temporal bone. Okay, so bony labyrinth first of all. Three main parts. So I'm going to talk about them in more detail in the next few slides, but just to illustrate now, I'll show you the parts. So this is the vestibule. This area here is the vestibule. we have these 3 semicircular canals, and finally we have the cochlea. So the bony labyrinth, this is very important to remember, the bony labyrinth houses the membranous labyrinth. Okay, so the membranous labyrinth is found inside the bony labyrinth. So this is obviously a cross section here, and we can see the internal structure of the bony labyrinth with the membranous labyrinth removed. Membranous labyrinth now, so we have utricle, which is this bulging structure here. Saccule is here. We have the okay, this is 2 structures. This number 3, these are structures which we cannot see visibly but are inside here. So we'll talk about them again in more detail, don't worry. Semicircular ducts, so similar to the semicircular canals because they're inside them. So inside the canals we have the ducts. Cochlear duct, which is inside the cochlea. This is the cochlear duct. And the organ of Corti, this is something which we can't see on this scheme, which we have to see under higher magnification. It's located inside the cochlear duct, which we'll go into more detail about. Okay, so let's jump into the bony labyrinth and the vestibule. So, what do I need to talk about here? I need to talk about first of all, where do we find it? It's the first. So we talked. Yeah, sorry. We talked about the middle ear cavity. We talked about the stapes, the footplate of the stapes, impacting the oval window. So we can see here. This is the oval window. Okay, this is the oval window, or the fenestra vestibuli. It's also called. The vestibule, which is this large irregular shaped structure here, can be modeled with different walls, like approximate 4 walls. So the medial wall has the most going on. Okay, so this is the medial wall here. We've opened up the vestibule, and we can see this is the medial wall here. So that we've got these recesses. There are three distinct recesses with perforations inside. So the first anatomical landmark we can use to divide up the recesses, or to divide up the medial wall of the vestibule, is the vestibular crest. So it's this structure here. This is the vestibular crest. Okay. Anterior to the vestibular crest, we have the spherical recess. Anterior to the vestibular crest, spherical recess. Posterior to this vestibular crest, we have the cochlear recess. So this is the cochlear recess. Okay, so just remember that first of all. Anterior is a spherical recess, posterior is the cochlear recess. First thing you need to do is to understand where the landmarks are and the names of the recesses. Before you understand what you find inside them, just memorize the names first. Okay, so spherical and cochlear recesses. Located completely behind this crest is this recess. This is the elliptical recess. Okay, it can be a bit confusing, especially when you read it in the textbook, so that's why you need to have the image in front of you as well. And this is the elliptical recess. Okay, this is everything that's happening on the medial wall. So a bit more detail now. Spherical recess contains macula cribrosa media. Okay, spherical recess, macula cribrosa media. So these are these tiny perforations which we can see present here, and the macula cribrosa media contain the roots, or the entrance for the roots of the saccular nerve, and the spherical recess itself contains the saccule, or the saccular. So this is a structure we're going to talk about in a little while. When we talk about the membranous labyrinth, we'll talk about what the saccule is, but just for now, remember that the saccule is found here in the spherical recess. And these small perforations are for the saccular nerve to emerge through. So then we talked about the cochlear recess. So cochlear recess is over here, and they contain the macula cribrosa inferior. So these are these small perforations found in this cochlear recess. And these are for nerve fibers, for the cochlear nerve, of the cochlear nerve, which innervate the vestibular end of the cochlea. So just to give you some context, this is the cochlea here, this spiral-shaped structure, and this therefore would be the vestibular end of the cochlea, because this is the vestibule. And finally, we talked about the elliptical recess, so behind the vestibular crest, and it contains the aqueduct, the vestibular aqueduct, And here we can find these small perforations. Again, these are called the macula cribrosa superior, and this is for the emergence of the utricular nerve and the ampullary nerve. Sorry, bear with me. Yeah. So utricular nerve and the ampullary nerve. And this innervates all structures of the superior vestibular area, located at the bottom of the internal acoustic meatus. So we're going to talk about the internal acoustic meatus in a few slides. So just for now, just break things down. So when you're looking at the bony labyrinth, break it down as I've done into vestibule, semicircular canals, and the cochlea. Looking at just the vestibule, look at the walls of the vestibule, medial wall, identify the structures you see, and identify the vessels or nerves, whatever it is that's passing through these structures before you move on. And always keep recapping, because this is a very the inner ear is a very tricky area for students for some reason. I think it's a tiny structure. It's very difficult to visualize, so it becomes harder to remember. So you need to spend longer when you study the internal ear. Anterior wall, very large opening with the communication for the scala vestibuli. So scala vestibuli is just imagine this as a space containing fluid for now. We'll add more detail on later on, but if you don't know anything about this scala vestibuli, it's this. It's one of these three spaces, okay? So this is scala vestibuli. This is the anterior wall, scala vestibuli opening here. Posterior wall has 5 orifices, so I'll talk about why there are 5 in a bit more detail later on, but these semicircular canals open up into the vestibule, so to give off these 5 orifices. Lateral wall, so the lateral wall is the wall that has been removed here, so we can see the wall here. We have the fenestra vestibuli, which is closed by the stapedial footplate, and the annular ligament. So these are all terms we've mentioned a few times before, so hopefully there should be no problem there. Okay, let's talk about the semicircular canals now. So when you use the word canal, you're referring to the bony structure housing the ducts. Okay, so there are 3 canals: an anterior, a posterior, and a lateral canal, semicircular canal. And each canal contains an ampulla. Okay, so this is just a dilation. And you might remember this name from when we studied the male genital system. You have the ampulla for the ductus deferens. So this is, the word ampulla is used a few times in anatomy. That's just the first one I could think of. So it's when you have a tube and you have an end of the tube which is just dilated or widened. It's ampulla. To illustrate that, here we can see the semicircular canals. We can see the ampulla here, ampulla 3. So there's 3 ampullae here. We can see. Anterior canal. So this is this canal here. This is vertical, and it's perpendicular to the long axis of the pyramid. So if I just go back a couple of slides, we can see the semicircular canals here. So this is the anterior. This is the anterior one here. Anterior one here. And when we talk about the plane of the long axis of the petrous part or the pyramidal part of the temporal bone, we're talking about this axis like this. Okay. So you should know that the pyramid is located here. Pyramid. Another name for the pyramid is the petrous part of the temporal bone. Sorry. So it's perpendicular to the long axis of the pyramid. Again, ampulla opens into the vestibule, which is common for all of these canals, and the opposite end of the anterior canal. So again, this is the anterior canal. So there's the ampulla is here, and the opposite end is over here. Opposite end doesn't directly open into the vestibule, but it fuses with this canal. So 2 canals fuse, okay, and they form what's called the common limb, or the crus commune in Latin. Now the posterior canal, again, it's vertical, but it's parallel to the long axis of the pyramid. It's very important to remember the orientations of the canals. Okay, so once again, anterior canal is located perpendicular to the long axis, and the posterior canal is located parallel to the long axis of the pyramid. Again, ampulla opens up into the vestibule, and the opposite end, similar to in the same way to the anterior canal, they fuse together and they form this common bony limb, which then open into the vestibule. Lateral semicircular canal. That's this one over here. This one over here, which we can see a bit of. It's horizontal. Sorry for the typo. And it's posterolateral. Okay, horizontal and posterolateral. Ampulla opens into the vestibule again. This is the ampulla, and the opposite end directly opens into the vestibule as the crus simplex. So we have three ampullae here. We have a crus commune and we have a crus simplex. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and that's why we have 5 openings or 5 orifices for the semicircular canals. Okay. So we talked about the vestibule, we talked about the semicircular canals, and now onto the cochlea. So this is the anterior part of the bony labyrinth, as you can see. The central axis is the modiolus. So this scheme is showing you a spiral-like structure, but it's a three-dimensional structure. So this, the cochlear cupula is located closer to the screen, if you imagine, than the base, which is over here. This physical base of the first turn. So it's a spiral structure, but in three-dimensional space. 2 3/4 turns of the canal. And in terms of the canal, I mentioned it terminates the cupula, and the modiolus, again, the base of the modiolus contains openings for the cochlear division of the vestibulocochlear nerve. The tract itself enlarges at the margins of the cochlear canal to form the spiral canal of the modiolus. So we'll talk about this in a little detail in a second. Yeah. This structure here is the bony structure which is encasing the cochlear duct, and this is called the osseous spiral lamina. This is very important to remember, okay? Osseous spiral lamina. It's important to remember because we can see it here. We're going to talk about this image in a bit more detail later on, but all of this is bone. All of this, it's like grey pinkish color, is bone. This is the modiolus in the center. And here we can see this bony-like protuberance is the osseous spiral lamina, okay? And it divides up this entire space into 3 distinct portions. So we can see a scala vestibuli here. Scala vestibuli we talked about was over here. We have a scala tympani, and we have the cochlear duct. Again, we'll talk about this in a bit more detail in a second. Yeah, the epithelium. I've put this in here because this is quite. This is another common thing which students often mistake. The epithelium, which lines the osseous labyrinth, secretes perilymph. Okay, this is the type of fluid which is present in specific parts of the cochlea, which I'll mention again in a little while. So these are the parts of the bony labyrinth. So if you've got any questions, just feel free to ask. But now I want to talk a bit about the membranous parts. So the stuff which is actually inside the bony encasing. So I'm going to start by talking about the vestibule and the utricle and sacculum in particular. So utricle is this bulging area here. This bulging area here contains a horizontally positioned strip or an anterior thickening, which is called the macula utriculi. Okay, these are specialized cells which are covered in a gelatinous membrane. So hair-like cells covered in a gelatinous membrane, and they can detect horizontal acceleration. So horizontal acceleration, macula utriculi. Just remember to make that association. We've already mentioned that it's a sac which is located and housed by the elliptical recess. So just to recap, elliptical recess is here. That's where we find the utricle. And the utricle itself is connected. You can see This is the utricle here. In this scheme, this is a cross-sectional scheme. So this is the external acoustic meatus, middle ear of the tympanic cavity, and the inner ear, just showing you the ducts. So this is the utricle here, and it's connected with the endolymphatic duct. This is the endolymphatic duct, and it's connected via the utriculosaccular duct. Okay, this is the utriculosaccular duct between the utricle and the saccule. Now the saccule again is a very small sac located next to the spherical recess. So the spherical recess, just to recap, is over here. And its anterior part again is thickened to form what's called the macula saculi. So this is a very specialized tissue which is able to detect vertical acceleration. So linear acceleration detection. These are the functions for both utricle and saccule. So the vestibule with the semicircular ducts is responsible for the detection of proprioception of the head and the body. So when you tilt your head in a certain direction or your body is in a certain orientation in space, there are obviously 3 axes of movement denoted by or detected by the fluid which is traveling and passing through the semicircular ducts. This is your orientation. Acceleration is detected by the utricle and saccule, and also the ampullae, which I'll talk about in a second. And the cochlea is a completely separate structure, which is for the detection or the recognition of sound waves. So we have 2 parts. Hopefully now you're starting to understand the 2 parts, the 2 divisions of the inner ear. So the vestibular part is all of this, and the cochlear part is over this. That's why we have 2 parts to the nerve, vestibular cochlear nerve. So in terms of the maculae, so maculae, we mentioned macula utriculae and macula saculi. They both contain an epithelium covered by these sensory hair cells with a membrane overlying them. This is a gelatinous membrane. It's called the statolithic membrane, which contains these statoliths and crystals, and they are what start the action potentials, which travel through these various nerves, saccular nerves, utricular nerves, and ampullary nerves, and then are recognized and passed on to higher central nervous system levels. Ducts, we briefly touched on the endolymphatic duct. So endolymphatic duct is located over here. It's joined by this small duct, the utriculosaccular duct, and it passes. So this is actually passing inside a canal. This is all bone. All this structure is bone. So this canal is called the vestibular aqueduct, and you can see it terminates in a blind-ended pouch. So this is the dura mater covering this pouch. This is the temporal bone, so dura mater over the temporal bone, and this is a blind-ended pouch. The ductus reuniens, or the reuniting duct coming from the saccule, is present here, and you can see it inferiorly passes to the base of the cochlear duct. Okay, semicircular ducts. The ducts have the same names as the canals. So we mentioned an anterior, posterior, and lateral canal, so the same names for the ducts. Again, 5 orifices into the vestibule. And one thing I wanted to mention, this is probably I should have highlighted this a bit more. The ampullae, so these thickenings, contain ampullary crests. There are ampullary crests. So 3 times 2, meaning there are 6 of these. 3 ampullae for each of the semicircular canals, and the function is very important. This is angular acceleration. So we talked about the utricle and the saccule in the previous slide. So the maculae of each of them are responsible for horizontal and vertical acceleration, and the ampullae, which are the ampullae of the vestibule, are responsible for detecting angular acceleration. The semicircular ducts contain endolymph, something very important to mention. Okay, so cochlear duct is the last one, which we're going to talk about in more detail now. So cochlear duct is filled with endolymph again. It starts at the vestibular cecum, ends at the cecum cupulare. You can check these in the book. Scala vestibule. What I want to talk about is the actual duct itself, And this is a scheme which has a bit more detail than you need to understand, but I just like the schematics. It's more relevant for histology, and like subjects you'll have after anatomy and histology. But just for now, I'm just going to touch on some of the basic structures you do need to know. So zooming back out to the actual duct itself, the scala vestibuli we touched upon. This is a space containing fluid, okay, and the scala tympani, again, this space here containing fluid, containing perilymph. So cochlea duct is here, which contains endolymph, and the scala vestibuli and the scala tympani contain perilymph. Two different, they're similar compositions, but they are different in terms of where they're produced and in terms of the substances which they contain. So there is a communication between the scala vestibuli and the scala tympani, which I think I forgot to mention, but I've got in a previous slide. I just want to point out. Maybe in this one. Yeah. So the helicotrema at the tip of the modiolus is where we have communication between the scala tympani and the scala vestibuli. If we look at this cochlear duct in a bit more detail, we can see that on a triangular cross section, we have borders. So this border here, this is the Reissner's membrane or vestibular membrane, very thin membrane. This floor is formed first of all by this structure which we have mentioned already, this bony structure, the osseous spiral lamina, and then the extension as the basilar membrane or basilar lamina. And laterally we can see this ligament here. This is called the spiral cochlear ligament. So external to the cochlea, which we can't see visibly here, but we have a very rich network of capillaries. This is just called the striae vascularis. You might see this in the book a few times. And the stria vascularis is responsible for producing endolymph. Okay, the endolymph is inside here, so stria vascularis. So now the organ of Corti. So organ of Corti is the name given to this structure here. And before I dive into the structures of the names of the cells we find, you have to understand the function first. So the function of the organ of Corti is to take a mechanical energy which is being provided by the movement of the liquid inside the cochlear duct, and the movement of the liquid is moving this tectorial membrane, which is then in turn vibrating these hair cells. The hair cells are producing the stimuli, initiating the action potentials, which will then accumulate and pass along these axons to the cochlear nerve. So that's how the signal is transduced. Auditory stimulus is generated and transduced. In terms of the actual structures, so if we look, this is the medial side, and this is the lateral side. So medially, first of all, we have inner hair cells. This is these structures here, and then we have pillar cell. We have an inner pillar cell, outer pillar cell, and then we have external or outermost hair cells. There's usually just one inner hair cell, and there are 3 to 5 outer hair cells. And then we have supporting cells. So there's a number of different names here, but all we need to know, there are supporting cells. Or in the book, the book talks about Dieter cells. So these Dieter cells here, and the Dieter cells are supporting the outer hair cells with these phalangeal processes. These green structures are phalangeal processes to anchor this reticular lamina in place. So what happens is that the liquid or the fluid, the endolymph inside the cochlear duct, will vibrate this tectorial membrane. Tectorial membrane is very sensitive. It moves and it changes the position of these stereocilia, the stereocilia on these outer and inner hair cells. Yeah, another thing I want to mention, there's a little tunnel as well, tunnel of Corti as well for passage of fluid between the pillar cells. Which contains the book. Some references talk about cortilymph, another type of fluid located between them. Okay, so we've discussed the three different parts of the auditory system. If you have any questions, please ask, because we're going to just jump into a bit more detail now. So I've got a couple of slides for the vestibular cochlear nerve. This is probably the most difficult nerve you've probably studied so far. A few days ago, we talked about in the visual system lecture. We talked about a few cranial nerves. Quite simple. Vestibular cochlear nerve is again, it's not so difficult if you take it one step at a time, but it can be quite confusing to students. So when you're studying this in your own time, study the inner ear in as much detail as you possibly can before studying the vestibular cochlear nerve. It'll really help with the naming, especially. So the way I've divided up my slides, first of all, this slide is showing you the origins of the nerve. And then I'll talk about the terminal parts of the nerve and the pathways to the cerebral cortex in the next slide. Just a quick overview. Obviously, cranial nerves will be talked about next week. But when you talk about the cranial nerves, first thing you have to understand is what type of fibers are contained in the nerve. So if you know what type of fibers are contained in the nerve, whether they are sensory or motor, and there are other divisions, but we'll just talk about sensory and motor. So sensory nerves start from the periphery, so skin or sensory organs, whatever, and they direct their axons are directed towards the central nervous system. Motor nerves, on the other hand, we talk about them starting or originating from the brainstem or whichever part of the central nervous system, and they emerge and then they extend to effector organs, glands, muscles, etc. The vestibular cochlear nerve is a sensory nerve. It contains some somatosensory fibers, but the majority of fibers are special sensory. So for the organ of balance and the organ of hearing. Okay, so we talk about them. When we talk about this nerve, we start from the sensory organ itself. So the vestibular cochlear nerve, as you may have guessed by now, has two different parts. Okay, the vestibular nerve and the cochlear nerve, but they're just combined, so we talk about it as one nerve. Dividing it up, we have to talk about the roots. So the cochlear root first is quite straightforward. So this is the cochlear root here, just one big root here, and so we talked about the hair cells from the organ of Corti. Hair cells are the organ of Corti. So just a quick recap: these are the hair cells. So these are providing these fibers, as you can see here. And the next structure is this structure. This is called the spiral ganglion. Okay. So the hair cells of the organ of Corti provide these bipolar dendrites. Okay, so hopefully you should know from biology the different parts of the neuron. We have a cell body. On one end we have an axon, and we have the dendrites on the other end. So the dendrites from this bipolar neuron extend to the hair cells. Spiral ganglia contains the cell bodies of all of these neurons, and the axons originate from the spiral ganglia. So this is the spiral ganglia. So the axons are proceeding down here. So this is another one. So these multiple spiral ganglia will collectively merge to form the cochlear root. Okay, that's all we need to know about the cochlear root. When it comes to the vestibular root, it's a bit more complex. We have two parts. Okay, so we have a superior part of the vestibular nerve, and we have an inferior part. So we can see them quite nicely here: superior part and inferior part. So let's talk about the superior part. So the anterior ampullary nerve. The name should hopefully make sense because we know we have the ampulla for the anterior semicircular duct. So this is the anterior semicircular duct. This is the ampulla. So the nerve coming from here, the nerve coming from the lateral ampulla, and also from the utricle. These three structures form the superior part, or the superior root of the vestibular nerve. Okay, three structures, superior root. The posterior ampulla and the saccule provide two nerves which fuse and form the posterior or the inferior part of the vestibular nerve. It's very important to learn the different parts of the roots. So these two roots will merge and form the vestibular nerve, which runs together in a sheath, common sheath with the cochlear nerve. So that's why it's called vestibular cochlear nerve. So these nerves will run together, and they will emerge through the, or they will travel through what's called the internal acoustic meatus. Hopefully you remember what this structure is. If not, please look this up. Internal acoustic meatus. You'll 100% you guys have seen this in class when you've studied the temporal bone. You'll know what it looks like. The opening of the internal acoustic meatus is called the fundus of the internal acoustic meatus, and this is a scheme which is essential to know for the final exam. So you can see here we divide the fundus into halves. To be more precise, I should have drawn a line in the middle because they're like talking about quadrants. Okay, so this is the superior part, inferior part, anterior ventral, and posterior dorsal. So this, what is it? This is a hole. Okay, this is an opening, and there are different areas. So you can see the superior anterior quadrant has this area here. This is the facial nerve area. So the facial nerve, which, I don't want to add too much detail right now, but the facial nerve also travels in this internal acoustic meatus. That's found over here in the superior anterior quadrant. The superior posterior quadrant contains the superior vestibular area. So the superior vestibular nerve, or superior root of the vestibular nerve, is found here. IVA, logically, inferior vestibular area for the inferior roots. And this is the anterior inferior quadrant, CA. So does anyone know what CA stands for? Hopefully it's quite logical. I'll let you guys have a think. So just think about what we've discussed and what was missing. So all of these different parts correspond to different parts of the vestibulocochlear nerve. Okay, so they emerge through the internal acoustic meatus, and you need to be able to discuss the passage of the nerve after that. So this is where the book is a bit deficient. I see no one's really answered the question. So it's cochlear area, okay? Okay, someone did. Sorry. As I said it, cochlear area, perfect. So yeah, the book kind of is a bit deficient in this area. It talks about all this stuff perfectly, but it doesn't talk about anything after this, and you need to know what happens afterwards if you have to describe this nerve. So the nerve emerges as a vestibulocochlear nerve, one whole nerve, enters into the posterior cranial fossa. Okay, the internal acoustic meatus. Okay, maybe I haven't got a scheme. Yeah, internal acoustic meatus opens into the middle cranial fossa. The nerve will travel posteriorly towards the posterior cranial fossa and enters the pontine cistern. Okay, so now we're talking about the area of the brainstem. So this is, if we just look at this scheme over here, this is a scheme you'll get acquainted with more and more as you study the cranial nerves. You'll know this perfectly. You'll know all the structures you can see here. But for now, I just want to illustrate. This is the brainstem. So there are three parts. We have the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the mesencephalon is here. This is the frontal lobe of the cerebrum, temporal lobe, and this is the cerebellum. So the vestibulocochlear nerve is illustrated here, and this is next to it, so more medially to it is the facial nerve, and they're both entering through this small area here. This area here, this interface between the pons and this structure behind the cerebellum, logically is called the pontocerebellar angle. Okay, you might see it as the cerebellopontine angle. It's the same thing. So this is where the nerve enters into the brainstem. And I found this really nice scheme online. I've sourced this in my PowerPoint, which will be uploaded. But you can see cranial nerve 8, which is over here, enters between the pons and the cerebellum. Okay, so pontocerebellar angle. Now, fibers of the cochlear nerve will synapse with anterior and posterior cochlear nuclei. Fibers of the vestibular nerve will synapse with 4 vestibular nuclei. So just keep that in mind as we look at the next slide. So just pay attention to the scheme first. I will explain the text in a second. So just to recap, this large, very thick nerve over here is the facial nerve. Okay, so we don't really need to talk about this now, but you can see how it runs with the vestibulocochlear nerve. The only reason I wanted to show this is just to show you that we have all these nuclei in the brainstem. So this is, just for your reference, is the inferior cerebellar peduncle. And surrounding them, we have on the lateral side, we have these 2 cochlear nuclei, and medially to them, we have the vestibular nuclei. Okay. So this pathway, these blue arrows, represent what are called first order neurons. There are several orders of neurons which divide up the auditory pathway or the vestibular pathway. So the auditory pathway has first order neurons from the cochlea, which is over here. You can see the cell bodies of the auditory or the cochlear neurons are located in the the spiral ganglion. I'm just going to recap to answer the question. So FNA is the facial nerve area. SVA is the superior vestibular area. IVA, inferior vestibular area. So these two are corresponding with the two roots we talked about. So we have the superior part of the vestibular nerve, inferior part of the vestibular nerve. So this is where they emerge. And then the CA is the cochlear area, so for the cochlear nerve. So hopefully these quadrants make sense. SF, I forgot to mention, is the singular foramen. And it's the opening for the nerve to the posterior semicircular canal. So there's a bit of detail there, but all you need to know is this is the singular foramen. And I guess another important detail is TC. This is it's TC here, but also called the horizontal lamina or horizontal layer. But just remember, the fundus is divided up into 4 quadrants. Hopefully that helps. Okay, so back to talking about the neurons. Cochlear nerve neurons have their cell bodies located in the spiral ganglia. So you can see these dots are denoting the nuclei of these nerves. This is one whole nerve. Okay, so these are the dendrites, the cell body, and then the axon, which terminates here. For the vestibular nerve, we have these different origins. The cell bodies are all located in this one large vestibular ganglion. It's a large bulging of the nerve, and then the axon projects to the vestibular nuclei. Now the arrow indicates a synapse. Okay, so these are all nuclei, but there's a synapse. The synapse takes place here. So then everything else after this level, so the ascension of these pathways to higher levels of the CNS are through second and then third and eventually 4th order neurons. So let's talk about some of those now. So axons from the and so we're going to talk. I've just divided up the cochlear pathway from the vestibular pathway. So there's a lot of information on the slide here, and this is just so that you can try and follow along with me. But the the principles are present. They're there. You can find all this information in Memaryk's and also in the 4th white book, the PNS book. So axons from the nucleus project to horizontal fibers. Okay, so they ascend. So the next layer will ascend as horizontal fibers. They will decussate. Decussation just means crossing over to the other side. So fibers from here will cross to the other side, and they will be present. And yeah, decussation is just crossing of fibers. So decussation means crossing or contralateral running of fibers. The opposite of decussation is where fibers run ipsilaterally. Okay, so fibers can either be contralateral, so they go from one side of the brainstem to the other side, or they can just stay on the same side, in which case they're called ipsilateral fibers, meaning same side. And then they will synapse in the superior olivary complex. Okay, it's another landmark you need to learn. Then the next, so now we've got another synapse. Okay, so now we have our next layer of neurons. So these axons will run from the superior olivary complex to the posterior cochlear and also from the posterior cochlear nucleus. So now these fibers have joined, and they will form what's called the lateral lemniscus. And I appreciate this is very difficult to understand. You can't visualize this unless you have the schemes of the cross sections open. So that might be a bit of help. If you have the cross sections open, you can try and identify all these structures. Okay, so these axons form what's called the lateral lemniscus. The lateral lemniscus enters into the nucleus of the inferior colliculus and the medial geniculate bodies, and this is really crucial. So when you're studying the thalamus, you'll learn that we have medial and lateral geniculate bodies. The lateral geniculate bodies are associated with the visual system. Hopefully you remember this from a few days ago, the lecture. The medial geniculate bodies, however, are associated with the auditory system. Okay, auditory pathway, cochlear pathway. After the medial geniculate body, in the midbrain. There will synapse here in the medial genicular bodies, and the next set of axons will pass through something called the internal capsule. So I appreciate that there's obviously a lot of terms, a lot of new terms. When you study the telencephalon, and when you study the thalamus, hypothalamus, and the cortex in more detail, you'll be more familiar with these terms. So internal capsule, for example, these gyri I'm mentioning. So please come back to this PowerPoint presentation, or come back to the nerves, and you'll start to piece together all these structures, because this information I've included here is like essential information. You unfortunately do need to know it all. So as confusing as it may look, you have got to know it all. So internal capsule, just to give you a little overview, is a collection of axons, and it's a pathway. Ascending and descending tracts will pass through a specific area of the telencephalon, and this area is called the internal capsule. I'm not going to jump into more detail now, but that's all you need to know. And the posterior part of this capsule contains these axons, and they will then travel to the external surface of the cerebrum, and they will terminate here on the superior temporal gyri, and specifically these transverse temporal gyri, which are part of the superior temporal gyri. Okay, B1, B41, B42, B41, 42. These are Brodmann's areas. So again, essential information. Brodmann's area 41, 42 refers to the primary auditory complex. Okay, primary auditory complex. You can see this. There's a nice table in the white book which has the cortexes and the associated Brodmann's areas. I think it's under the telencephalon chapter, so you'll find this there if you need to. Okay, and from here they will sign up to the cortical neurons. That's the entire auditory pathway. Now the vestibular pathway is a little bit more straightforward. So the axons, which are going to originate from the vestibular nuclei, which we see over here, these 4 nuclei, will travel in several directions. So these are just the 4 other directions they will travel towards. And what might help you understand where they go is if you think about the functions. The vestibular system is all about balance. Okay, so this detection of balance has to be understood by the brain in different areas. So balance is related to coordination. Okay, so one of the functions of the cerebellum and the cerebellar nuclei is to coordinate movement and like locomotion. So there's a lot of neurons which travel to the cerebellum via the vestibulocerebellar tract. The names of these tracts, hopefully you've studied the tracts with the spinal cord and brainstem in more detail, so you'll know that there are you'll know how to name these tracts. So vestibulocerebellar just means coming from the vestibule, which is the inner ear part we talked about, and going to the cerebellum. Motor neurons for the anterior horns of the spinal cord, so vestibular spinal tract, inferior olivary nucleus, and cerebral cortex. These are all structures which you do need to just unfortunately memorize to be able to give a complete start to finish of the of the nerve in general. So we talked about where the nerve started in the inner ear. We talked about the emergence, the roots, and then we talked about the nuclei. And I gave you the theory of what happens after these nuclei and where the information is processed. So the information is processed in different areas because we've got 2 different nerves essentially. The cochlear part for the auditory pathway, so understanding and interpreting sound, and then understanding and interpreting balance, acceleration, and movement. This is all the vestibular nerve. So 2 different systems working here. So if you've got any questions, feel free. Otherwise, and even in the next few slides, carry on asking if you have any questions. But I've got 5 questions I want to ask you guys. So everything mentioned in the next few questions is stuff which is either on the slides or stuff that I've mentioned. So hopefully you guys are able to answer them. So yeah, have a go. These are questions which they're not past paper questions, but they're questions which I've made to, I guess, simulate how the questions might look. So you might get a question like this in your exam. So take some time. I'll give you a little bit of time and just type the answer if you think about it, and I'll wait about 10 seconds or so, and then I'll reveal the answer and go through it just very briefly. Okay, so correct answer is B. Scala media, cochlear duct, does not contain perilymph, it's endolymph. Option C, the membranous labyrinth is not contained. The membranous labyrinth is completely different to the osseous bony labyrinth, so C is incorrect. C talks about the bony part of the labyrinth. D, the scala vestibuli contains endolymph. Again, it's the opposite thing. So you do need to know about what the what is contained inside the perilymph. What is contained inside the vestibuli, the tympani, and the media. So that's not something I forgot to mention. Option A refers to the cochlear duct as a scala media. So this is just another name for the cochlear duct. Okay, next question. I'll give you about 10-20 seconds to answer this. So just pay attention to the questioning. It's incorrect. So you've got to choose what's incorrect here. So the correct answer, all statements are correct. So it's a bit of a trick question. So hopefully there shouldn't be any issues here. So pyramidal eminence is the protuberance of the posterior part of the tympanic cavity, which contains the muscle we talked about, stapedius muscle. Tensor tympani muscle, I tried to stress the innervations of the tensor tympani and the stapedius muscle. Tensor tympani being innervated by the mandibular nerve, which comes from the trigeminal nerve, whereas the stapedius muscle is innervated by the facial nerve. So the nerve to stapedius, which comes from the facial nerve. Helicotrema, I touched on this very briefly. It's the opening through which both the scala vestibuli and the scala tympani will communicate. And incudostapedial joint is indeed an anarthrosis. So this is a ball and socket type joint. Okay, third question. I'll give you about 20 seconds. So the correct answer in this one, all statements are correct again. So cochlear duct does indeed contain apparatus for sensation. Statolithic membrane is found in the macula, yes, both. Anterior and posterior ducts do unite as the crus commune, and diator cells are supporting cells, okay, with their phalangeal processes. So it's a bit of a tricky one. So when you see, so this statement, obviously, this question is all answers are correct. So when you see that option, and you know that two of those options, so A, B, C, D, so two of the four are correct, you can be pretty confident that all statements are correct. So you might know that two are correct. The other two might look a bit iffy, so it should give you some indication that, okay, maybe you need to start thinking about option E as an answer here. Okay, I'll give you a bit of time for this one. These last two questions are mainly about the, actually no, sorry. The final question is going to be about the nerve exclusively, but Okay, so if you got this one right, the answer is E. So no statement is correct here. Okay. Cochlear root of the nerve is formed by superior and posterior divisions. This is incorrect. So it's the vestibular root which has superior and posterior. Superior and posterior divisions. That should be. Actually should be incorrect. That should be inferior. So this statement is incorrect. The cochlear root just has one root. There's no division we need to talk about. It's the vestibular one which has two divisions. Macular utriculi detects angular acceleration. That's incorrect. It's the ampullae of the semicircular ducts which detect angular acceleration. The macular utriculi is responsible for detecting horizontal acceleration. Cochlear duct contains tegmental membrane. Okay, that's not correct. I threw this one in because students often confuse these words, similar words together. So it's tectorial membrane, which would be correct here. Tectorial membrane. Tegmental refers to the bony superior roof of the middle ear. Round window is covered by foot of stapes is incorrect because it's the oval window which is covered by the foot of stapes. So the subtle differences. This is how they will present the questions to you. The incorrect answers will have some subtle differences. So one or two words will be incorrect. So next question. This is the final question. Okay, so the correct answer here is C. Bipolar somatomotor neurons, incorrect. Okay, because somatomotor, nothing to do with this nerve. Somatomotor refers to as the name suggests, to skeletal muscle. Okay, so just remember skeletal muscle. So a lot of nerves will innervate muscles. So these are somatomotor neurons. B enters the brainstem. It doesn't enter through the retroolivary groove. It enters through the pontocerebellar angle. These are landmarks which you'll get more familiar with as you study the brainstem and as you study the cranial nerves. So I understand it. It's a trick. It's a bit of a difficult question for you guys right now, but just as long as you remember, vestibular cochlear nerve enters the brainstem at the pontocerebellar angle. You won't confuse that with anything else. And well, obviously the facial nerve also, but those two nerves exclusively. So helicotremor. Helicotremor is the. Let me just show you a picture. So we have the inside the cochlea itself, we have these three scala which I mentioned. Okay, so the scala vestibuli, which is over here, the scala tympani, and the scala media, or the cochlear duct. So the scala vestibuli and the scala tympani, just go back, actually communicate with each other. So they're separated through the entire length of the canal, and they communicate with each other at this point here. So helicotremor is where the scala tympani and the scala vestibuli are able to communicate. So basically, there is passage of fluid between them both. Okay, and just to finish up explaining the last question. So we identified C as the correct answer. So we mentioned medial geniculate bodies. I've seen this option in robot exam questions before, where they try and confuse the auditory pathway, so medial geniculate bodies, with the visual pathway, which are the lateral geniculate bodies. So very, very small structures on the posterior inferior aspect of the thalami. So when you study the thalamus and the associated nuclei, just pay attention to the geniculate bodies. Cochlear nerve area, I've literally just taken the wrong quadrant. of the fundus, which we discussed, that scheme. So this is incorrect. So you do need to have an understanding of the scheme of the actual opening of the internal acoustic meatus. So guys, if you have any questions, that's the end of the PowerPoint presentation. If you've got any questions, feel free to ask. I've got a list of sources here. If you need any, if you want to have a look when you have a chance to recap. And yeah, thank you guys for your attention. We've got a Facebook. We've got the feedback form in the event description in Facebook, and I've got a link here. So I'd really appreciate it if you let me know. Let me know how the event went, so we can continually improve how we offer these to you guys. So yeah, feel free to type questions if you have. If not, thanks guys. Have a great day.